This is the last of 3 lectures from Chapter 20, and this last lecture will focus on nuclear processes called fusion and fission. Just as a brief introduction, fission means to split a nucleus into smaller pieces, and fusion means to combine nuclei or parts of nuclei into a larger one. So students in the past have remembered this by us. Fusion has us in it, which means we come together. And so we talked about radioactivity, which implies that a substance is spontaneously emits fragments from its nucleus. There are also nuclear reactions that are not necessarily spontaneous. For example, nuclear power plants. Nuclear power plants operate on nuclear fission, and we need to initiate these reactions by bombarding the unstable substance usually with like a neutron or something. But anyway, we can kind of accelerate or initiate nuclear reactions also, and that's what this last lecture is about. Both of these processes we're talking about, fission and fusion, release enormous amounts of energy. You may have remembered in the last lecture I talked about something called the strong nuclear force, which I said was the strongest force known to mankind, and that is the force that holds the nucleus together. And so anytime you have any type of nuclear reaction, enormous amounts of energy are released because you have unleashed some of the strong nuclear force. Okay, so for example, in a nuclear power plant, we will often use uranium, okay? Uranium, the most abundant or most predominant isotope that occurs naturally has a mass of 238, but that isotope is not radioactive, okay? The uranium-235 isotope is radioactive. It's less stable and therefore easy to get its nucleus to split. So, but out of a naturally occurring sample of uranium, less than 1% of that is the fissionable uranium-235. And that's not a high enough percentage to really sustain a nuclear reaction in a nuclear power plant. And so you may have heard the phrase mentioned that uranium enrichment. So there are some nuclear power plants that do a process they call nuclear enrichment of uranium-235, and that they're basically kind of taking the uranium-235 out of the big mix that is mostly uranium-238. And so in a nuclear power plant, or for different applications, not just nuclear power, we will take a relatively unstable nucleus like uranium-235 and bombard it, accelerate a small particle at it, and most of the time, or a lot of times, it's simply a neutron. And at a high rate of speed and therefore force, the neutron will bombard the rather unstable nucleus and cause fission. And so when uranium-235 undergoes fission, it breaks into smaller fragments, happen to be barium and krypton, or just stable results of that, and it releases 3 more neutrons as well as a tremendous amount of energy. Well, guess what those 3 more neutrons it releases go on to do? Assuming you have a bunch of uranium-235 in that sample, these 3 additional neutrons that have been a byproduct will then go and bombard additional particles of uranium, and you have yourself what we call a chain reaction. And so once you get the nuclear reaction going by bombarding it with 1 neutron, the reaction takes on a life of its own and multiplies and gets larger and larger and larger. So that's where the potential of an out-of-control nuclear action can come from. So if you're going to start playing around with nuclear reactions, you need to have a way of controlling this chain reaction. Just to give you a pictorial of a chain reaction, fission, imagine we're in a nuclear power plant, so we need one little neutron to bombard an initial atom of uranium. That splits apart and produces more neutrons, which then go on to bombard additional atoms of uranium, and on and on and on. So you can see how it exponentially increases the amount of nuclear activity and energy that's produced. Most other countries, developed countries, get most of their electricity from nuclear power. So European countries, an average of about 70% of their power. In the U.S., because we have quite a few people who are, I think, fearful of nuclear power, and so we only get 20% of our power from nuclear reactors. It's kind of a real easy overview of how a nuclear reactor works. Is the fuel rods, these bright yellow things, are the uranium-235, and in between them are black rods, and they're called control rods. They are made of material that absorb extra neutrons, and so once we get the reaction going in the fuel rods start spewing out more and more and more, exponentially more and more neutrons, and we don't want the reaction to get completely out of control. So we can put in as many control rods as we want to absorb the extra neutrons and control the nuclear reaction. The tremendous amount of energy that is released is used then to heat up water, which then turns into steam. The steam turns an engine, turbine, and generates electricity. So any type of, quote, waste you see from a nuclear power plant is simply steam. There are no byproducts. There's no waste. All the nuclear activity stays in this containment shell, and only steam is released. Now, what needs to be disposed of are the spent control rods. Okay, they've absorbed a lot of neutrons, and so that's where the big debate is do we bury those? How do we handle those? But to give you an idea of how efficient nuclear power is, if you take 50 kilograms of fuel, a nuclear active substance, it'll generate enough electricity for 1 million people. Again, no pollution other than burying the control rods. The same amount of energy using coal would take 2 million kilograms instead of 50. So almost 1 million times more. Coal produces all sorts of polluting substances that are hurting our atmosphere. So there's a big debate on which of these is preferable. So this is pretty much, again, a written summary of what I just talked about. So if you would like to kind of put the video on pause and read through it to make sure you understood the basics of what I said about control rods, etc., you are welcome to. This is just a really cool little side conversation here. And during a nuclear reaction, we can actually convert, mass is actually converted into energy. So remember we've learned in the beginning of chemistry about the law of conservation of mass. And the mass of reactants must equal the mass of the products. Mass can't be produced or destroyed. That is all true with normal chemical reactions. It is not true in nuclear reactions. Nuclear reactions, actually, when they occur, some of the mass disappears and is converted into energy. And that is where Einstein's famous E equals mc squared comes from. And that was Einstein that realized that energy could, in fact, be converted from mass, and c is the speed of light. Okay, so and that is only from nuclear reactions only. Okay, otherwise mass is conserved. So just to give you an idea, I wouldn't make you work any of these problems, possibly as a bonus, but certainly not on the regular test. So in this nuclear reaction, again, of uranium, the mass of the reactants is around 235 atomic mass units. The total mass to begin with, 236, and the total mass to end up with, very close, but it has lost a little bit of mass. And so how much energy can be produced from that little amount of mass that was lost? So here's the amount of mass that was lost, converted to kilograms, so we can multiply it by the speed of light. And this is how much energy we've made from that little amount of mass, which is probably doesn't mean much to you, but it's quite a bit of energy. So here's another example of a nuclear reaction. And this is actually the reaction that occurs in the sun. This is fusion, okay, where you combine smaller nuclei to make a larger. This is where the sun gets all of its energy from. It's made primarily of hydrogen, and you have two hydrogens combine and to give you helium. And it releases a tremendous amount of energy. And you calculate that energy by looking at the mass that is lost, and it's that mass that's lost that is converted to energy. So the mass that is lost in a nuclear reaction is called mass defect, okay? And then again, converting that to energy like we did on the last slide, we see that this fusion reaction releases a ton of energy too, and much, much more energy than fission. So if we could figure out a way to make fusion occur practically down here on Earth, it would be like a gold mine as far as an energy source. However, fusion occurs at very, very high temperatures. That's why it occurs on the sun. And that's an almost impossible situation to maintain down here on Earth. So far, scientists haven't been able to find a way to harness fusion on Earth so that it's economical and productive. So here's something that quantifies it a little. Fusion produces 10 times more energy per amount as fission. So this third lecture, we have talked about nuclear reactions that have to be initiated by bombarding them with an accelerated particle. And so we call this process transmutation, and that's basically transforming one element into another element using a nuclear reaction that makes use of accelerating a particle. So I'm not sure if you've heard about particle accelerators. They're quite a bit in scientific news lately. The linear accelerator can be relatively portable, and the linear accelerators are what are used for providing radiation to treat some types of cancer. And so that's something you would find in a hospital, for example, that would fit in a room. So the huge type of particle accelerators, the largest one in the world, is called the Large Hadron Collider, LHC. That's fascinating if you want to Google that and read a little bit about it. I don't know if you remember, I think it was sometime last year or something when there were some news splashes that said we found the, quote, God particle. There's some missing subatomic particle that scientists have speculated for years existed, and we believe we are confirming its existence using this Large Hadron Collider. It's in Switzerland. It literally goes around like the whole city, but they basically have particles, for example, a proton or something that gets accelerated around this huge area and then bombards unstable nuclei, and they analyze all the products from it. And to finish up chapter 20, we've talked about some of the good ways or productive ways to use nuclear chemistry. There are a lot of medical uses, and there are also some basic research uses. There's some really common ways that radioactive isotopes are used. All smoke detectors have a little tiny piece of radioactive americanium that makes them work. We also use them in some farming agricultural applications for food preservation. There are a lot of radioactive tracers. So many elements, even though the normal elements aren't radioactive, they often have an isotope that's radioactive that when ingested in the human body can be used to trace and determine the function. Like, for example, I don't know if you've heard that your thyroid, which is an organ in your neck area, absorbs iodine. In fact, needs iodine to function regularly, and that's why we have iodized salt. But a few years ago, my thyroid stopped or seemed to be stopping working, and so there's a radioactive isotope of iodine that they had me ingest. I just drank something with a little bit of it in, and because it was radioactive, they could trace its progress through my body. It got absorbed into my thyroid, and then they could see exactly where my thyroid was blocked, where it was working, where it wasn't working, and they could diagnose. So it's another common way. So there are a lot of good uses, and make sure that you understand the difference between fusion and fission, and that you could diagram both of them. And that is it for Chapter 20.